And good morning to you. It's Saturday, December the 9th. I'm Velshi. We begin this hour with an alarming new threat to democracy from Donald Trump and the active measures that he and his acolytes are taking to follow through on them. As Donald Trump campaigns for a second term in the White House while facing dozens of criminal charges that imperil his freedom, he's made it explicitly clear that he intends to bend the American government to his will if he's returned to power. A whole political apparatus already exists that's ready to go. Its members are even talking about these plans right out in the open. And Donald Trump himself is so emboldened as to be throwing around the D word.
You are promising America tonight you would never abuse power as retribution against anybody.
Except for day one. We love this guy. He says, you're not going to be a dictator, are you? I said, no, other than day one. We're closing the border, and we're drilling. After that, I'm not a dictator.
Dictator for a day isn't a thing, at least according to the U.S. Constitution. But if Trump wins a second term, he won't need a day two because his team has a game plan ready to go, and they can do a lot of damage right from the beginning. Take, for example, Trump's renewed promise to close the border on day one, which calls to mind the first week of his first term in the White House. Just 7 days into the job, Trump signed an executive order reducing the number of refugees allowed in from 7 predominantly Muslim countries. It was hastily done and caused chaos in the immigration system and prompted protesters to hold demonstrations and march in the streets. Lawyers camped out at airports and offered their services to help those who were affected, and the order itself got tangled up in a legal battle. The architect of that order was this man, Trump's senior advisor, Stephen Miller, who's likely to lead Trump's immigration efforts again if he wins a second term. Last month, the New York Times reported that those efforts will include sweeping raids, giant detention camps along the border, mass deportations of millions of people each year. According to Miller himself, quote, Trump will unleash the vast arsenal of federal powers to implement the most spectacular migration crackdown. The immigration legal activists won't know what's happening, end quote. Apparently, that's the lesson Trump learned from the first time around, and that's the point. Miller, along with Trump's other close allies and acolytes, have identified the problem areas that prevented them from enacting their most extreme policies during his first term, and they have learned how to get around the guardrails that acted as checks on the president's power. Far from being deterred by those earlier shortcomings and failures, the takeaway from Trump's inner circle has been that if they get another 4 years in the White House, they will operate without any restraints.
We will go out and find the conspirators, not just in government, but in the media. Yes, we're going to come after the people in the media who lied about American citizens, who helped Joe Biden rig presidential elections. We're going to come after you. Whether it's criminally or civilly, we'll figure that out. But yeah, we're putting you all on notice.
Y'all are going to have to extradite me from Canada. That was Kash Patel, by the way, who worked in the National Security Council and Defense Department during the Trump administration, saying the quiet part completely out loud. Trump's second term would crack down on dissent. It would stifle free speech and opposition inside and outside the federal government. They'd go after journalists. That effort is already underway with Project 2025. It's a plan to overhaul the staffing of executive branch agencies that could involve thousands of bureaucratic employees replaced by people who are perfectly aligned with Trump's ideology. As John McEntee, a former Trump White House aide who's now involved in Project 2025, told the New York Times this summer, quote, it's not enough to get the personnel right. What's necessary is a complete system overhaul. Fealty to Donald Trump will be the only thing that matters. Experience, expertise, and independence from political influence would become a thing of the past. Despite Trump's very long history of lying, there are some things that he and his allies are saying now that we actually have to take very seriously because they are sending a message and a warning about what is to come. Joining me now is someone who has been sending that warning for years about the dangers that the former president poses to democracy. Michael Cohen is a former personal attorney to Donald Trump. He's the principal of the crisis management firm Crisis X. He's the author of the New York Times best-selling books Revenge, How Donald Trump Weaponized the Department of Justice Against His Critics, and Disloyal, a memoir. He's also the host of the podcast Mea Culpa with Michael Cohen and the political beatdown. Michael, good to see you. Thank you for being here. I mean, the weird part about this story, and the reason you're on with me, is you've actually been saying this for a long time, that this is what he's going to do if given half the chance. And he's not hiding it. His people are not hiding it. The stuff that Kash Patel just said, while that was targeted at media, they're basically saying we're going after critics, we're going after enemies, we're going after the opposition, we're going after the media.
Yeah, Ali, don't listen to what Michael Cohen is saying. Don't listen to what Ali Velshi is saying or any of the pundits you see on television. Listen to what Donald is saying. That's the whole point. And yes, I had talked about this going back 3 years and 2 years. And then when my book Revenge came out, it's all laid out in there. Donald Trump does not want to be president of the United States. How many times have I said it, even on this show? He wants to be the dictator, the monarch, the Führer, the king. That's what he aspires to be. And when he says that he's going to be dictator on day one, I want to ask you this question. I want to ask your viewers this question. When was the last time somebody became a dictator for just one day and then decided to give it up? Yeah. The answer, of course, is never. Once Donald tasted that power, he craves it more and more. And everybody, when he says, for example, like the president and the CEO of this station, of MSNBC, he will jail him, or Joint Chief of Staff Mark Milley, he will execute him. Don't laugh and just say, come on, Donald's a dope, right? He's just being bluster. He's being Donald. He's being dead serious.
But Michael, that's exactly what people say. That's exactly what people say. And you know, because you talk to them. You're like, don't listen to that stuff. That's what he does. That's how he talks. You've known him for a long time. How do you delineate between the bluster when he says just dictator for a day? He talked last year about getting rid of the Constitution. I mean, how do you know what's a joke and what's not with Donald Trump?
First of all, Donald Trump doesn't joke. He does not have a sense of humor. In fact, ask anybody who knows him and say, have you ever heard Donald tell a joke? And the answer is no. Everything that he's saying is on his mind. He is so emboldened right now to say what he wants. He sees himself right now as the obvious Republican nominee. So at least it's a 50-50 election between him and Joe Biden. However, with all the polls now bolstering him and saying that he beats Joe Biden, his rhetoric is going to get more and more dangerous. It's going to get more and more anti-democratic. He's going to continue to say these things which just make you scratch your head and say, how are we as Americans even allowing somebody who says this sort of stuff to run for the office of the presidency? We are right now in a position where we will lose democracy in 2024. And I don't want to be right. Unfortunately, knowing Donald as well as I do and seeing the writing on the wall, I know that I am.
Let me ask you about this. What if it's not about control and dictatorship, but it's about the thing that you know very well with him, and it's about loyalty? Because what a lot of his people around him are saying is it's about loyalty and fealty. Donald Trump's not going to pick his cabinet based on their skill set and their experience. He's going to pick his cabinet or his advisors based on how loyal they are to him. Parse that for me. Is that less or more important? Is it less real or more real? Is it less or more threatening?
It is more threatening than most people could possibly imagine. You will have an entire transition team of loyalists. He will also have members of the military sign a loyalty oath to who? To him. When was, again, let me go back to what I just said before. When was the last time that we had a president or any significant leader in this country ask another person to take a loyalty oath, not to the Constitution, not to American democracy, but to that individual? I mean, that is an autocratic mindset. That is what a king does. I mean, just think about all the movies that you've seen about, kings. It's like, I pledge to the king, all hail the king. That's what Donald wants. He wants to be like Mohammed bin Salman. He wants to be like Kim Jong-un or like Vladimir Putin. And, the thing that most people are ignoring, and this applies to everyone, when Donald has full authority and full power, You can't imagine the things that he's going to do, how far he's going to press the line. If you think Vladimir Putin, Russia entering Ukraine is, for a land grab, well, what do you think Donald is going to do if he becomes a dictator? Mexico, Canada, whatever our bordering countries are. So, Ali, when you said that you're running to Canada, half my family lives in Toronto. I can only tell you, we can't go to Canada because eventually Canada will become annexed to America. And I know people say, stop it, Michael. It's all hyperbole. No, it's not. Donald sees himself not as a human. He sees himself as like a god. He believes himself to be above all of us and that he wants to, be the king. He wants to take over the world.
Do you believe he really believes that, or do you believe he's able to convince people of it so he's riding that wave?
No, I think he actually now has convinced himself. That's the classic definition of a sociopath. That is what Donald has become. He, with the people around him, constantly providing him with accolades and pats on the back. You're right, Donald, you're right. All of a sudden, it's like, I'm going to be a dictator on day one. I mean, come on, who's the last dictator that the United States ended up fighting? We all know, right? We all know it was World War II. Donald Trump will put this country into a third world war. And the problem for, people like myself is I have a son and a daughter who are of fighting age. And I don't want to see my children off to war. I don't want to see anybody's children off to war. But Donald will do it. Why? Because it is part of that loyalty oath. It is the fealty to the king. Send them out. Whatever happens to them, I don't care, as long as I get what I want. That's all that Trump is about, getting what he wants.
Michael, as always, I appreciate your analysis.
Be afraid, Ali, as I say to everybody.
You've been telling me for a long time.
Be afraid.
You've been telling us for a long time.
Afraid.
Now he's actually telling us. His people are actually telling us all this stuff that you've been talking about is real. Michael, thanks very much. Michael Cohen, former personal attorney to Donald Trump, author of the books Revenge and Disloyal, host of the Mea Culpa podcast with Michael Cohen and Political Beatdown. All right, we just scratched the surface of the potential threats to democracy that a second Trump presidency would pose. Coming up, we're going to take a closer look at some of the very specific ways in which a second Trump term would be worse than the first, based on the things that Trump has already said and done. Then, while much of the attention is being paid to Israel and Gaza, the war in Ukraine rages on, but much-needed U.S. aid is now being held up by Republicans in Congress. Plus, we've got today's meeting of the Velshi Band Book Club featuring contemporary classic The Perks of Being a Wallflower with the author, Stephen Chbosky. Only about 20 pages into the book, there's a line that has become ingrained in American culture. It's so widely applicable and so honest that it's hard to believe it wasn't written before 1999. Quote, "We accept the love we think we deserve." Ukraine is entering yet another brutal winter of war, fighting to protect its borders from Russia. It's worth noting again, as we enter day 654 of this war, that Vladimir Putin thought his invading forces could capture Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, in 3 days' time. The Ukrainian resistance has been nothing short of extraordinary. But as this war draws closer to its second anniversary, it's starting to look like Ukraine's time might be running out. According to the Wall Street Journal, Western diplomats and military strategists have described the Ukrainian military as depleted and say it may not be able to mount another significant counteroffensive until 2025. This is an important date. Also this week, the chief of staff for Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky warned that without more U.S. military assistance, Ukraine faces a big risk of losing the war. Unfortunately, that much-needed aid is not likely to come soon. Senate Republicans are now holding up President Biden's $110 billion national security package, which includes roughly $50 billion in assistance for Ukraine. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said Republicans will not vote for the bill unless it's amended to include new border security measures, which is no small demand, given that lawmakers from both parties have been failing to enact meaningful border security and immigration reform for decades. And Ukraine, it bears repeating, does not have decades to spare. Former United States ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, told me last night that this is dead serious and that more Ukrainian soldiers will die. A top White House budget official underscored that point this week, saying in a letter to Congress that this is not a next year problem. Quote, there is no magical pot of funding available to meet this moment. Cutting off the flow of U.S. weapons and equipment will kneecap Ukraine on the battlefield, not only putting at risk the gains Ukraine has made, but increasing the likelihood of Russian military victories, end quote. Joining me now is Michael McFaul, former United States ambassador to Russia and MSNBC international affairs analyst. He's also the author of the book From Cold War to Hot Peace, an American ambassador in Putin's Russia. And I know this is not a man who's had much sleep because he and I talked late last night. So, Ambassador, thank you for being here. We don't want to get into that's right. You and I have about the same amount of sleep. We don't want to get into the business of comparing tragedies and wars because all wars are bad. But there is something existential about this one that maybe Americans are not registering. That we didn't all think about Ukraine a lot. 2 years ago, a lot of people couldn't find it on a map, probably. But now we are understanding that for a Russia that wishes to be an expansionist force, Ukraine is actually really, really important. And if it falls, there is much more danger to come in the world.
I think that's absolutely right. Remember, this is the first major conventional war in Europe since 1945, since World War II. Remember why we fought that war. We fought that war to stop annexation. And by the way, for decades, we did a good job of that. We got rid of annexation by and large. There were some pockets of it. And we also fought that war to end imperialism. I think that's very important for people to realize. We ended imperialism and annexation. This is a return to that. And if we go back to that world, we go back to a Hobbesian anarchic world where there's wars all the time that we will be pulled into all the time. That's not a world I want to go back to. And that's why we need to support the Ukrainians now so that Russia does not advance to threaten the rest of Europe and pull us into those kind of conflicts, especially when those kinds of NATO allies where we have a treaty obligation to fight with them.
Right, so that's an interesting point, that if Russia goes beyond Ukraine, which Volodymyr Zelensky has suggested he will, and if you study Vladimir Putin's writings and speeches, there have been those implications. If they hit a NATO country, if they decide they want to go for a NATO country, we're in that war one way or the other. We have an obligation under Article 5 of NATO to be involved in that. So we can either do this now or we can do it later in an actual full war fashion.
Tragically, I think that's true. And again, go back to World War II, where there was annexation. We're just going to take this. We're just going to take that. That's what Hitler said. We put our head in the sand. We said, not our problem. That's a war far, far away. And then even after 1939, when Hitler went into Poland, we still said, not our problem. Then we were attacked in 1941, and it became our problem. So rather than waiting for that moment, right now is an amazing deal for American national security. This appropriation, $50 or $60 billion, allows us to let the Ukrainians fight the threatening enemy, the Russian army, without American soldiers having to be involved. It's an incredible deal for American national security.
Let's talk about another thing that you raised last night, and that is there are other expansionists in the world. There's China eyeing Taiwan and other places in Asia. There's Iran, which is not looking for territorial expansion, but is involved in all sorts of other fights around the world. This is a message. They're all watching this very carefully. If America stops its support of Ukraine, the message to many of these people around the world is America is not going to police this sort of thing around the world. And I know there are not a lot of Americans who don't want us to be in that role, but without it, there will be expansionism in other places, not just having to do with Russia.
That's exactly right, for a couple of reasons. Number one, all those countries you just talked about are all allied together, right? The president of Iran was literally just in Moscow yesterday. Who does Iran fund? They fund Hamas and Hezbollah. If we help Putin win in Ukraine, we are helping Iran. They are all allied. Same with China. Who is China's #1 partner in the world? Russia. And if we embolden Putin, if we allow him to succeed in Ukraine, that makes a possible attack on Taiwan much more likely. If we lose our credibility in the world, if we're not considered credible and we're going to be there for a while and then we're going to pull back, that emboldens all of those kinds of autocratic countries and movements around the world. And eventually that comes back to haunt us because we won't be able to keep our head in the sand if there's conflict in places like Israel, like Taiwan.
Ambassador, always a pleasure to get your analysis, even when it's on grim stuff. We really appreciate it. The former United States Ambassador Michael McFaul is MSNBC's international affairs analyst and author of From Cold War to Hot Peace, an American ambassador in Putin's Russia. Coming up, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is getting so dire that the World Health Organization says more Palestinians could soon die from disease than from actual strikes by Israel. Coming up next, I'll talk to a former minister from the Palestinian Authority about this catastrophe. Humanitarian operations in the Gaza Strip have crumbled as Israel's bombing campaign now enters its third month. On Thursday, the United Nations humanitarian chief announced, quote, "We do not have a humanitarian operation in southern Gaza that can be called by that name anymore." Tens of thousands of displaced Palestinian civilians are now crammed into two tiny patches of land, one along the coastline and the other in the border city of Rafah, located in the far south. The UN has slammed these sites as a poorly planned solution whose overcrowded and unsanitary conditions make them rife for spreading disease and hunger. Conditions at these sites have deteriorated to the point where there is only one toilet for every 600 people, according to a UN report. As a result, the World Health Organization warns that more Palestinians could soon die from disease than from bombs. Meanwhile, on Thursday, Israel announced that it would open a second crossing into Gaza, restricted to inspections for incoming humanitarian aid only. On Friday, nearly 57,000 pounds worth of U.S. aid for Gazans was delivered to Egypt, but UN officials warn that Israel's bombing campaign, coupled with endless displacement, have made the humanitarian situation even more dire. On Monday, UN humanitarian chief Lynn Hastings stressed that, quote, "the conditions required to deliver aid to the people of Gaza do not exist." Israel's response to that statement was to revoke her visa. Meanwhile, the primary UN agency that facilitates humanitarian assistance for all of Gaza is, quote, "just barely operating," according to its head. In a letter posted to X, he warned, quote, "our staff take their children to work so they know they are safe or can die together. I've never written such a letter predicting the killing of my staff and the collapse of the mandate I am expected to fulfill," end quote. The war has resulted in more than 17,000 deaths, with 70% being women or children, according to the Gaza Health Ministry. NBC cannot independently verify those numbers. On Thursday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken informed Israel that casualties are still unacceptably high. In an additional sign of the growing rift between the U.S. and its longtime ally, American officials this week began discussing post-war governance plans with the Palestinian Authority officials and regional Arab allies. The talks come on the heels of Netanyahu rejecting the return of the Palestinian Authority, which administers some of the occupied West Bank and used to administer Gaza. For more on this, I'm joined by Dr. Hanan Ashrawi. She's a Palestinian political and civil society leader. She previously served as a spokesperson for the Palestinian delegation to the Middle East peace process. Dr. Ashrawi, thank you for being with us again. I appreciate the time that you take.
Thank you, Alex. It's good to be with you.
Let's talk about the future. There is an ongoing question about who negotiates a future and whether or not this horrible war that we've got serves as a precursor to a more durable solution in the Middle East. But we can't really get to that because we don't have negotiating parties that are clearly established on the Palestinian side or on the Israeli side. Netanyahu says talking to the Palestinian Authority is a non-starter for him. But most experts will tell you Netanyahu is a non-starter for purposes of long-term negotiations. So where are we in terms of what happens next?
Well, if you're talking in general about the future, I think it's important to understand there's a concept, a principle in international law, which is the right to self-determination, and it applies to the Palestinian people. So the real issue is to recognize and grant the Palestinian people the right to self-determination, rather than enable everybody else to determine our future. Right now, also, the most pressing need, if we are to have a future, if the whole region is to have a future, is to put an immediate end to the carnage, to the slaughter. You cannot talk about a future when people are not only being traumatized, they are being killed, torn to pieces, their homes, their institutions, hospitals, schools, universities, everything is being destroyed. And the American administration is saying, no, 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 they need more time to carry out their objectives. And their objectives are really very lethal. And then they talk about a future. The best thing to guarantee a future is to give the Palestinians justice, their rights, their freedom, their dignity, and their future. But if you continue to bash the Palestinians, to kill them en masse, to continue with the massacres and the ethnic cleansing and the genocide, there's no future for anybody.
What is the impact of that? Oh, sorry about that. What is the impact of that? All of these deaths that we are seeing, they harden people. They harden people's hearts. So things that look like a negotiated discussion, things that you were involved in the 80s and the 90s, seem farther away with each bomb that lands, with each new civilian death.
Absolutely, yes. When the talks were beginning or started, there was an assumption that there is parity, that international law would apply, that the future would involve two states, so to speak, with equal rights and so on. But now the Israeli government continued with settlement expansion, with land theft, with annexation, with, again, a very violent policy, home demolitions, extrajudicial executions, mass arrests, and so on. So it was negotiating in bad faith. There was ill will from the beginning. And the signed agreement was more honored by the breach than by the implementation. And so the Palestinians learned a lesson that you can be nice, you can apply international law, you can try to please even your adversary, and you end up with more war, with more carnage, with more aggression, and with more loss of land and resources. So in that sense, the defeat of the peace agenda came as a result of a very hardline Israeli policy that wanted to annex all of the West Bank and to superimpose Greater Israel on all of historical Palestine, creating a system of apartheid and entrenching the idea of a settler colonial apartheid state that is implementing the Nakba agenda of displacement and replacement, of uprooting, dispossessing the Palestinians and taking over their land and negating all their rights. And Netanyahu says it openly, and now he has in his coalition, of course, people who want to carry out mass transfer and ethnic cleansing and so on openly. He says, no Palestinian state, no negotiations, no sovereignty. So what kind of make-believe world are they talking about? It is very disingenuous to talk about a two-state solution when you allow Israel to destroy the Palestinian state, to expand and annex land, and to continue with full impunity without any kind of intervention or accountability and without providing any protection of the law for the Palestinian people. So it's become just an empty, hollow expression, just to avoid taking responsibility.
So when you talk about Palestinian self-determination, what are the conditions that need to exist now? I understand the stopping of the hostilities, a ceasefire, but beyond that, what's the mechanism by which Palestinians can make determinations about their self-determination, about who represents them, who sits at a negotiating table, what a future looks like for a Palestinian state?
Well, precisely, it's the Palestinian people. Now, how do you get Palestinian representation? Of course, through elections. But how can you bring a traumatized people to go to elections when they don't have homes, when whole families have been destroyed, when they are still in a state of shock and trauma and grief and so on? So we need probably more of a transitional phase to be able to recoup, to be able to recapture our spirit, to be able to see that there is hope, that there is life. Everybody is living in the midst of carnage and death and massacres and destruction and so on. So you cannot tell people who are there being destroyed systematically while the world is watching, now sit up and be nice guys and elect your leadership. It's not going to happen that way. We need elections, but we need some time, we need recovery in order to have elections. And it's not just Gaza, it's also the West Bank that is traumatized, as you know. And disingenuously, they say, it's the settlers, so we're not going to give them visas. We're tough luck because most of the settlers have American passports. They are American citizens who are stealing our land and who are armed to the teeth and who are killing. And it's also the Israeli army that is killing Palestinians in the West Bank, that is demolishing homes, and that is aiding and abetting the settlers. So don't tell me a handful of settlers, we won't give them a visa. It's a question of a whole system of land theft, of expulsion, of death and murder. So in the West Bank and in Gaza, there is an apartheid system that is intent on ethnically cleansing Palestine. How do you deal with that in order to do that? The mechanisms probably will have to involve international engagement, and certainly the U.S. administration has disqualified itself completely. This administration has proven to be party to the conflict, has aided and abetted genocide, has funded it, has sent weapons to Israel without any kind of restraints and accountability, and then talks about two-state solution. Again, it's disingenuous. Kill fewer people, they say. Well, don't kill any people. That's what we're saying. And let's start immediately with a cessation of Israel's aggression and massacres and genocide, and then let's inject some kind of justice and respect for international law and humanitarian law, which Israel has totally rejected from the beginning.
It sounds like those things that you outline are a long way away, but we must discuss them in the hopes that they appear sooner than we all hope. Hanan Ashrawi, as always, thank you for joining us. Hanan Ashrawi is a former official spokesperson for the Palestinian delegation to the Mideast peace process. We'll be right back. A second term for Donald Trump could pose an existential threat to the very foundations of our 246-year-old democracy. This is not mere speculation or hyperbole. It's based on what Donald Trump has already done and what he's tried to do and what he openly promises that he will do in the future. That stark warning comes from The Atlantic, whose staff recently published an in-depth series looking at the potential risks to our democratic institutions in the event of a second Trump term. The special edition published this week serves as an urgent clarion call to the American public. One of its contributors, Barton Gellman, meticulously outlines how Trump could leverage presidential powers for potentially authoritarian ends. Notably, Gellman warns that Trump's camp is actively searching for loyalists among Republican ranks. Some also warn that there's an inherent risk to engaging in doomsday scenarios, however plausible they may be, that could inadvertently be contributing to Trump's narrative of invincibility. Experts in authoritarianism, such as Ruth Ben-Ghiat, stress the need to assess the dangers to democracy while also considering the psychological and political impact of how we frame these issues. In an interview with the Washington Post, Ruth notes authoritarians create a climate where they seem unstoppable. Creating an aura of destiny around the leader galvanizes his supporters by making his movement seem much stronger than it actually is. The manipulation of perception is everything. Joining me to discuss is the aforementioned Barton Gellman, award-winning journalist and staff writer for The Atlantic, and Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who's a professor of history at NYU, the author of the Lucid newsletter that tracks threats to democracy and author of the book, Strongmen, From Mussolini to the Present. Thank you to both of you. Ruth, I wanted to understand that quote that I read in the Washington Post from you more clearly, because you are one of these people who studies and warns of looming authoritarianism around the world and in America. So what's the point that you're making, that it's possible that it could happen, but it's not inevitable?
It's never inevitable. And one of the lessons of the history of autocracy and resistance to it is that people can behave in ways that they can mobilize to protect democracy. Look what happened recently in Poland. Many people thought, oh, the Justice and Law Party's been there for years. It's not going to, they're going to go the way of other states. Instead, they turned it around. So, but the reason that, one of the reasons Trump and his camp are telling us what they're going to do, which some people say, why are they doing that? You know, doesn't that work against them? Is they want to create a climate of inevitability and fatalism and get people to feel overwhelmed and as though there's nothing they can do but submit. And so this is part of the psychological warfare, which is twinned with information warfare and threat. These are all the tools of autocrats, and Trump knows how to use them very well.
So, Bart, I'm going to ask my director to put up the front cover of The Atlantic that I'm talking about, because I feel like you and your colleagues there are attempting to say to talk about what Ruth is talking about, that it's not inevitable, but you do have to be informed. This is a series of essays and articles in one edition that deal with very specific things that the Trump administration did, the Trump campaign, and Donald Trump have suggested they will do or are planning to do. So how do you deal with that? How do you deal with people who say, you're all a bunch of alarmists, this is not how it's going to go down?
Yeah, sometimes people say, why can't you write something uplifting? And the reason is that this is not an ordinary election. The stakes are much higher. The stakes are democracy. We are sleepwalking towards some kind of authoritarian government if we're not careful. And this is a warning. This whole issue, conceived by Jeffrey Goldberg at The Atlantic, is a warning of what would come if we don't stand up and stop it. And so if you're not paying much attention, if you're thinking this is an ordinary kind of choice, if you're not doing all you can to protect the democracy, this issue is a call for you to step up.
Ruth, if you are paying attention, one thing you'll notice, as we saw in the referendum in Ohio about abortion recently, in the off-year elections that took place at the same time, in the midterm elections, is that this concept of preserving, as voters, your personal freedoms under the Constitution is motivating to people. It is animating to Americans. Does that translate into some hope for you that people who might read this, your stuff, or read this Atlantic issue, will sit there and say, look, we can talk about other political differences later, but right now this is about democracy. I can get involved and I can actually solve this problem.
Yes, absolutely. And if we're not informed by people like Barton and the many others, we won't know how serious the threat is, and we won't understand the framework for these attacks on reproductive and other rights. And we know from the history of social movements that if people feel that their personal situation is touched, or they know people who are being persecuted or will be, that is very galvanizing for people to get involved. So we both need the warnings, but we need them without the fatalism. Because the other thing that's happening is the Trump campaign is threatening people who are the truth tellers right now. That's why Senator Vance said that Robert Kagan, who wrote the the Washington Post piece about, Trump dictatorship being inevitable, they want him to be investigated. It's also why when Trump sued CNN, I was named in the lawsuit for having written an op-ed that exposed the methods of his big lie propaganda. And what authoritarians want is for you to feel you have to self-censor. Right. So that nobody will write about this anymore. And in self-censoring, you make the autocrats